Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having Kurtis and myself here today to speak with you a little bit about how our office at the North Bay Mattawa Conservation Authority plays a role in sustainable development through the watershed. So we'd like to start by giving you a little bit of background about the Conservation Authority itself. Across Ontario, there are 36 conservation authorities, and the North Bay Mattawa area extends approximately 2,900 square kilometers across the area, and it's based on the watersheds of Lake Nipissing and the Ottawa River basins. It is our mandate in the office to provide protection to people, property, and the environment through watershed management, leadership, and collaboration with the municipalities, residents, and other agencies. Our office provides a variety of different programs and services throughout the watershed, and some of these services include planning and development, regulations or permit issuance. We have a drinking water source protection program, water quality monitoring programs, flood forecasting and warning program. We have the on-site sewage system permit program, which also has a mandatory maintenance inspection division. We have conservation area lands and trails, a stewardship program, and we participate in outreach and special events. So I'll pass it over to Kurtis.
Hi, everyone. So as Valerie mentioned, as a conservation authority, we regulate development within our watershed with respect to natural hazards. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about sustainable development in the context of natural hazards and what that means. So I think sustainability sort of asks us to look into the future and see if what we can do, if we can keep doing what we're doing forever, if it can be sustainable. And so I think we need to avoid and mitigate natural hazards to the maximum extent possible. If our development's getting flooded or if slopes are moving and causing us to move our development, then that's not probably sustainable. We want to build things once and build them to last. So to talk about natural hazards, I think it helps if we take a step back and look at the big picture. So here's another image of the water cycle. I'm sure we've all seen this before. But basically, water comes out of the atmosphere as precipitation. It can be rain or snow, and then it goes into three main places, right? We have evapotranspiration, which is evaporation of water from the land or transpiration by plants. We have surface runoff, and then there's infiltration down into groundwater flow. Groundwater flow has some advantages over surface runoff. It inherently sort of slows down the movement of water towards the receiving water bodies and streams and provides some filtration of nutrients and sediment that might be in the water. Surface runoff tends to pick up contaminants from the surface, and it's much more directly related to flooding and surface erosion and those processes. So how does development affect hydrology? The slide could have been titled Effects on the Watershed or Effects on Wetlands. They're all sort of related to one another. I tend to think in terms of hydrology. But generally speaking, there's a few different ways, and I'm going to touch on these in a little bit more detail. But development tends to involve removing vegetation from the landscape. Often you want to change the grades, remove soil around, so that often involves removing the vegetation. It tends to create more hard or impervious surfaces, a lot of pavement and roads associated with development. And there's also sometimes a loss of wetland and natural sort of water storage areas. I'll go into a little more detail about that. So generally speaking, development tends to increase surface runoff, which can cause increased erosion, can reduce water quality, and increase flood potential. However, there are ways to attempt sustainable development. I say attempt because I think sustainable development is quite difficult, and we're probably not totally there yet. There's lots of different aspects to it, but today I'm just going to talk about natural hazards specifically. So the removal of vegetation. As I mentioned, often in development you want to change the grades or move earth around, and that often involves clearing vegetation, trees and shrubs and that kind of thing. Sometimes we put it back, but even when you do that, vegetation takes time to establish itself again, so there's always going to be some effect. And a lot of times we just end up with these grassed areas, which are helpful, but not sometimes as good as the native vegetation would have been. So that involves, then you have decreased water uptake by the plant, so you don't have the same root network down in there that's taking up water for transpiration. You don't have the root network that's going to stabilize the soil and help reduce the effects of runoff. So it sort of has compounding effects when you remove vegetation. You can see some of the effects there of grass slopes that have failed over time. So I think best management practices with respect to sustainable development can help mitigate this to some extent. But we want to be conscious about putting the vegetation back where we can and continuing to stabilize our soils. As I mentioned, development often involves increasing the hard impervious surfaces in the area. So you have pavement for roads and sidewalks, you have roofs. Also just inherently running heavy machinery over a development lot can sort of compact the soil and reduce its infiltration capability as opposed to the loose native soils that might have been there before. So this results in decreased infiltration. So you don't have that water going through the ground and getting filtered out, and it increases surface runoff, which has a much lower time of concentration and can run into the receiving bodies much more quickly. It can cause issues about flooding or erosion. There are a few ways to mitigate this. There are some best management practices we could use, such as stormwater management measures or low-impact development techniques. You can see there's an image of some permeable pavement that somebody's holding, and that would allow water to sort of seep through the pavement structure back into the ground. There's some caveats to that, though. I mean, permeable pavement often tends to get laden with sediment, and it can get plugged up, so you sort of have to maintain those areas and make sure that there's a plan for that. Another thing you can do is, for example, disconnect your downspouts or use infiltration galleries. A lot of areas, they'll put the roof downspout right underground into an infiltration gallery that can sort of help water sort of seep back into the ground. This doesn't work in all areas. Sometimes if you have a high bedrock, for example, there may not be room for the water to infiltrate down. So there's not every solution is appropriate for every site, but there's usually something that you can look at doing to help mitigate the increased impervious areas and runoff. So thirdly, we have a loss of natural water storage areas. So wetlands and other wet areas are generally unsuitable for development for a variety of reasons. They can have soggy and unstable soils. There can be bugs that people don't like, and they tend to sort of have a high water table in those areas. That's why the wetland's there. And that can cause water issues in basements and foundations and that kind of thing. So development often involves filling in these areas. But we have to be careful when we do that because wetlands play an important role in the hydrology of our watershed. They act as natural water storage areas. So as water runs off the land, it's going to fill up those wetlands, and it's going to take a little bit more time to get to the streams and the lakes where we could have potential flooding issues. They also play a role in filtering out sediment and other nutrients from the water. Wetlands tend to be sort of flat and areas of lower velocity in a watershed. So if you imagine a stream flowing down steep areas, it could pick up sediment and other nutrients. Then when it gets to the wetland, it sort of allows those things to settle out. And to some extent, erosion and deposition are natural processes. But you have to be a little bit careful with development that you don't upset the balance of those things and overload the capacity that the wetland has. So I think sustainable development in this context involves creating new water storage areas or wetlands. It could be stormwater management areas, it could be smaller things like rain gardens, sort of to help mitigate flood potential. Speaking of flood potential and floodplains, I don't think it would be a Conservation Authority presentation if I didn't talk about floodplains a little bit. So a floodplain is the area of land near a watercourse or water body that could become inundated or flooded with water during periods of high runoff. They tend to correspond to specific storm events. So in our area, we look at either the Timmins storm event, which was a real storm. It was about 193 millimeters of rain in 12 hours. It was a big thunderstorm that happened up in Timmins, so quite a bit of rain. We also look at 100-year storm events. Those tend to be sort of synthetic design storms that we use. But they tend to have less precipitation than the Timmins storm overall, but they're a bit more intense. So depending on the characteristics of your watershed, you might find that one or the other tends to govern. A 100-year storm, I think, typically is about 122 millimeters in 24 hours, or for a 12-hour one, it'd be about 99 millimeters. Yeah, so you can sort of see there what happens to the what happens to the watercourse when flooding happens. Water level comes up and sort of inundates a larger area of land. And So you have to be a bit careful when you develop then that you're not going to increase the floodplain or cause detrimental effects to your neighbors or other areas of the watershed by increasing the flood hazard. You can sort of see on the graphic there what happens if you were to fill in a portion of the creek. You might displace water and cause houses that weren't previously flooded to be flooded, which obviously wouldn't be a sustainable process. Ideally, development is going to be located outside of floodplains and away from steep slopes and erosion hazards, but there are some ways to mitigate this. For example, the Conservation Authority, we often help people do a cut and fill volume analysis. So if you want to fill in part of a wetland or part of a floodplain area, there's lots to look at when you do that, but one of those things is to maintain the volume of water that can be stored there. So we might ask you to cut away some of your land in another area to sort of maintain the natural storage. And then with steep slopes and erosion, there's things you can do like planting and stabilizing with rock and plantings and other methods. So there's some ways to mitigate these things, but it's important that we think about them and implement them where appropriate. So with that, I'll turn it back to Valerie.
All right, so my role at the Conservation Authority is the Regulations Officer. So I would like to kind of give you guys a little bit more of an idea of what our office does to work with you for sustainable development. There's a variety of ways that we work with you as property owners or our member municipalities or other agencies throughout our area of jurisdiction. We routinely receive a variety of general inquiries from property owners or municipalities looking for information to see if your property is regulated by our office and what that means for you, how it's regulated. Do you have a floodplain on your property? Information that will help you as a property owner better understand what is on your property or what hazards might be there. We offer free pre-consultation services, so if you are potentially looking at undertaking a development on your property, you can contact me directly, and myself, and sometimes Kurtis would assist as well. We would come out and discuss with you maybe where the floodplain is on your property, how much your property may be subject to flooding, so the depth of the floodwater. We could talk with you about setbacks that you might need to meet to ensure that your development on your property is sustainable. We undertake project and permit reviews and provide planning comments to our member municipalities. So more specific and technical information, understanding required floodproofing requirements or conditions, getting a better idea of what those development conditions or site stabilization measures might need to be on your property. And we also issue permits. So if you are looking at doing any development or site alteration on your property, which includes the construction of structures of any size or the placement, removal, or grading of fill material on your property in a regulated area, we work with you to make sure that you have a permit prior to starting that work and make sure that there's applicable conditions so that we can ensure that what you're doing is being done in a sustainable manner. So I'd like to kind of start this slide off by asking everyone a few questions. I would like to know if there's anyone in the audience who owns waterfront property somewhere in and around the North Bay area. A few people. What about people, maybe do you have property that might have a wetland on it? Not many? How many of you might use recreationally areas in and around North Bay, such as Laurier Woods or other local trails like out back that has watercourses or wetlands on it? Lots, many people in the audience. So we all play a role in landscape sustainability. We are all out there using the landscape, these areas in and around water bodies, watercourses, and wetlands. We all may, or some of us might, undertake development in these areas. We all share the space with each other, and we all need to make sure that we follow the applicable rules for the way that we use these properties. Municipalities play a role in sustainable development. Contractors, such as landscape contractors, builders, other construction contractors, planners within our municipality, property owners. Schools participate as well. We partner with a variety of different schools throughout the area on different projects. businesses, and other regulatory agencies such as Ministry of Northern Development, Mines, Natural Resources and Forestry, Ministry of the Environment, Conservation and Parks, Ministry of Transportation, and Department of Fisheries and Oceans. This picture here on the screen is a development site on Trout Lake that was it's a number of years old now, but you can see this is sediment fencing down along the bottom of the screen. It's the black tarpy material. Further down, if we were to look a little bit further on the picture, that's where Trout Lake would be. But you can see this sediment fence was well installed, and it completely kept that work area isolated from the lake to ensure that any of those disturbed soils on site did not make its way down and impact the lake or the shoreline of the property. I want to show you guys a few other examples of some sustainable development in and around the North Bay area. I'd like to start on the top left corner. We have a very large dock. This is a property with frontage on Lake Nosbonsing in the area. And there was a very big shoreline wetland on this property. Wetlands are very sensitive. They play an important role in flood control, protection against erosion, and an important role in the environment itself for a variety of different shoreline critters that might live there. So this person wanted to try to get access to the lake for the use and enjoyment of their waterfront property. So in this case, we were able to work with the property owner to find a plan that would allow them to construct the dock to get them access to the lake while having as low impact on the wetland as possible. So it's a very long dock to get out to the usable lake space. However, it was a post-supported dock which had a very, very small actual footprint on the wetland, and there was no vegetation removal involved in constructing this dock. So very, very small impact on the landscape or the wetland itself, but the property owner was still able to achieve their goals for the project. Underneath that one, we have another picture of a well-installed sediment fence around a construction site near Lake Nosbonsing on the other side of the lake this time, keeping the work area isolated from the lake. And then the two pictures on this side here, the top one, we have a vegetated shoreline. This shoreline it was one of the ones where you see a lot of grass right up to the shoreline of the water, which is better than nothing. However, when you do have more woody or shrubby vegetation, it plays a little bit better of a role in stabilizing the shoreline. So they undertook some planting, and then they had a more naturalized shoreline. This bottom picture here is another Trout Lake property, and you can see they have a beautifully treed natural shoreline. And when we were working with this individual, we were able to provide some education and awareness and help that property owner understand the importance of maintaining the vegetation that is on site, which is playing a role in the stabilization of that slope leading down to Trout Lake, as well as assisting in infiltration and uptake of water before it makes its way down to the shoreline. So I'm hoping these are some pictures to show that our office is here to work with you to make sure that you are able to achieve the goals of your projects, and we can provide some advice and guidance along the way to help make that more sustainable. Oh, I went the wrong way. So at this point, I would like to provide the audience with a few best management practices that you could consider if and when you undertake development on your own property, which might be regulated, or if you have friends or family who might be doing development in or near watercourses, water bodies, or wetlands, just some information that you could share with them. One of the first and easiest methods that or best management practices you could apply in your development project is the installation of sediment controls. So a few slides back, I pointed out that black tarp, the sediment fencing. That's what I'm talking about here. So making sure that you've got a sediment fence. Some people use straw bales with wooden stakes to hold them in place as well. And this again helps keep your work area isolated. So those big rain events that we've been receiving lately, when the rain comes down and hits all those disturbed soils, the soils then don't make their way into the watercourse. They get caught behind the fence, and it keeps it isolated to prevent that runoff. So I have a question to see if anyone knows the most important part of installing a sediment fence. What might that be, if anyone wants to take a guess? Yes, I'm not sure. It came from this direction. Thank you. So she said the fence has to go into the ground, and that is correct. So you want to make sure when you buy your sediment fence, there's a green line or a red line usually along the bottom of the fence, and it's really important that you dig a trench, and you put the bottom of the fence into the trench, and then backfill. If you don't do that, you might see the fence in the wind flapping, and then what happens when you have those rain events or the runoff, all of the water, including all of the sediment that it might be carrying, goes right under the fence, and the fence is not isolating your work area. So super easy to do, it's time consuming, but it's the most important part of installing that sediment fence to make sure that it is actually doing what you intend it to do. Another best management practice that everyone could try to apply in your project is the maintenance and/or enhancement of any natural vegetation that you have on site. So Kurtis talked about it, and a few other presenters talked about it today, the role that vegetation plays in stabilizing your banks, slowing the flow of water, promoting it to infiltrate into the ground. And another added kind of concept that you could pull into the picture here is if you don't have a natural vegetated buffer, you could plant one, and you could plant native trees or shrubs or perennials. They play an important role. They're great for pollinators. They love the native vegetation and the flowers, but they also generally tend to have larger root systems. So the root systems will cover a greater area, so they'll help hold together that much more soil particles and keep it in place. But the roots also tend to go deeper into the ground. So when you have deeper roots, you don't have as much maintenance because the roots go deeper and it gets water longer than just those short surface roots when the surface of the soil dries out faster. So lower maintenance. Our office actually on our website has a native plant guide which provides a variety of different trees, shrubs, and perennials that are known to grow well in this area. And we also have some example planting plans from some plantings that we've done in the past. So if anyone is interested in any of that information, especially the plant guide, it is available on our website, or you can contact us directly, and we can certainly email you an electronic copy of that as well. One of the last best management practices I'd like to bring to your attention today is one that a few people have talked about already, is rain gardens. So, you know, I asked people, there weren't too many people who lived on lakefront or had wetlands, but how many of you might live in a more urban or city setting? Much more of the audience. So this is something that you could even incorporate on your own property within a neighborhood that's not on the water. Rain gardens, again, you could use native plants. They are very aesthetically pleasing. They can bring beauty to your garden or your yard. And what you would do is create a small garden area near the outlet of your downspout or your gutters. And what that helps you do is address any of the stormwater runoff on your own property, and again, allow that water to infiltrate into the ground on your own property before it has time to run off. You know, it might go down the side of the street or your ditch line. It could erode some of the soils and sediments. Pick that up and then enter into the storm sewer system and then make its way to the local watercourse as well. So these rain gardens are definitely something. They do not have to be big. They can be, you know, incorporate them with gardens in other areas on your property, but something that we can all do for sustainable development on our own properties. So that is it for our presentation, but we wanted to make sure everyone was aware that the North Bay Mattawa Conservation Authority is celebrating our 50th anniversary this year, and there are a few different programs we have in place. We have our Shout Out to Watershed Heroes program, And this is something where if you as an individual know a person, an educator, a business, or an organization that is playing an active role in protecting the environment, please let us know and we can recognize them as a watershed hero. So there are some watershed heroes already highlighted on our website for a variety of different activities or roles that they have done in the environment. So you can email us at watershedheroes@nbmca.ca to let us know. We also have our Boardwalk of Champions, and this is a program where you can acknowledge a champion in your life, someone who's made an impression on your own life or who has helped you, and you want to recognize them for their help. You can make a donation and have a plaque engraved with their name, which will then be displayed in one of our conservation areas. And all of the donations go towards the support of our scholarship and outreach programs. So again, you can email us if that's something you are interested in at champions@nbmca.ca. Thank you.